Zhiro woke to the sound of water dripping. Not the chaotic patter of rust-quarter rain, but something more regular, more natural. Condensation forming on the ancient brick ceiling above him, and falling in steady drops that had worn a small depression in the stone floor over decades, or perhaps centuries. Each drop struck with a hollow sound that measured time in a way that had nothing to do with hours or minutes, that spoke instead of entropy and decay, and the slow, inevitable collapse of all things. He didn't remember falling asleep. One moment he had been staring into darkness, mind churning through impossible revelations and equally impossible choices, and the next consciousness had simply stopped. No dreams this time, or at least none he could remember. Just the void of exhausted sleep, his body and mind shutting down whether he wanted them to or not. The candle had burned down to nothing during the night, leaving only a small pool of hardened wax on the ledge. A waste. He could have blown it out, saved the remaining stub for later, but his exhaustion had been too complete for such practicalities. In the Rust Quarter, such carelessness could mean the difference between survival and death, and Zhiro felt a flicker of self-directed anger at the lapse. Though perhaps, given what he'd learned about himself, such concerns were becoming irrelevant. What did it matter if he preserved a candle stub, when reality itself might end if he failed at a purpose he didn't understand? The thought was too large, too overwhelming for the pre-dawn hours. Zhiro pushed it aside and focused on more immediate concerns. His body catalogued its various complaints as consciousness fully returned. The throbbing ache in his throat where Kong had nearly crushed his windpipe, the stinging cuts on his hands and knees, the deeper exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue and suggested something fundamental had been depleted. And underneath it all, a new sensation. A kind of awareness that hadn't existed before yesterday. As if he could feel the golden sigils that now marked his skin, not with physical nerves, but with some other sense that had no name. They pulsed faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat, a reminder that he was no longer, had never been, entirely human. The interface at the edge of his vision remained, a semi-transparent presence that he could ignore but never truly forget. When he focused on it, text appeared. Thread warden status. Time elapsed since awakening. 8 hours, 17 minutes. Rest quality. Poor, spiritual exhaustion persists. Recommended. Consume food/water before physical activity. Current objectives *. Find new shelter, urgent. Acquire sustenance. Seek knowledge of thread arts. Zhiro dismissed the interface with a thought. Another thing that felt too easy, too natural, as if his mind had always been designed to interact with such impossible constructs, and sat up carefully. His body protested every movement, muscles stiff from sleeping on a pile of rags, joints aching from yesterday's violence and flight. He needed to move. The Bronze Fong would return, probably with more men, possibly with someone who possessed tracking abilities that his amateur attempts at concealment couldn't defeat. And even if they didn't find him here, staying meant starving. The 13 copper crescents hidden against his chest wouldn't buy much, but they could at least purchase one meal before he left the Rust Quarter. One last meal at Old Mo's stall, perhaps. A final taste of terrible noodles and watery broth before he ventured into the unknown, seeking an academy that might help him or might dissect him for study. The thought of food made his stomach cramp painfully. 2 days without eating, and yesterday's expenditure of whatever force powered the thread arts, had left him hollow in ways that went beyond simple hunger. He felt brittle, as if his body might crack and crumble if subjected to any significant stress. Zhiro stood, swaying slightly as his vision darkened at the edges, and waited for equilibrium to return. When it did, he moved through the darkness with the sureness of long familiarity, gathering his meager possessions. The copper crescents were already secured in his shirt. The flint and steel went into a small pouch tied to his belt. The moth-eaten blanket he rolled and bound with twine. It was too bulky to carry easily, but the nights could be cold even in summer, and he had no guarantee of finding shelter in the days ahead. He left behind the broken crate that served as a table, the cracked clay jar that had held his savings, and the pile of rags that had been his bed. They were too obvious, too distinctive. When the Bronze Fong eventually found this place, and they would given enough time and resources, Zhiro wanted them to find nothing that confirmed he had been here. Better they assume Lin had been mistaken, that the boy they hunted had never used this basement at all. Small precautions, probably futile, but Zhiro had survived this long by taking small precautions seriously. He felt his way to the narrow crawlspace that led to the sewers, the escape route he'd kept hidden for months against exactly this kind of emergency. But at the entrance, he hesitated. The sewers were a maze, easy to get lost in, filled with reality distortions that made the Rust Quarter's surface seem stable by comparison. And in his current state, exhausted, starving, barely able to stand without swaying, navigating that labyrinth seemed like an excellent way to die of exposure or worse. No. Better to risk the surface streets, rely on his ghost boy reputation and newly discovered presence suppression to avoid detection. Get to Old Mo's stall, buy food, eat enough to function, and then make his way toward the Academy district before the Bronze Fong mobilized in force. Decision made, Zhiro retraced his path through the collapsed building's lower levels, moving by touch and memory in absolute darkness until he found the concealed entrance he'd used to access this place. A section of wall that looked solid, but was actually loose rubble carefully arranged to appear intact. He'd discovered it by accident 2 years ago, had spent weeks ensuring no one else knew about it. Now he pushed through, disturbing as little as possible, emerging into a narrow alley that ran between 2 condemned buildings. The sky above was barely lighter than the basement he'd left. The pre-dawn hours when the world existed in shades of grey, when even the twisted architecture of the Rust Quarter seemed subdued and uncertain. Zhiro took a moment to orient himself, letting his eyes adjust to the relative brightness, then activated his presence suppression with a conscious effort. The skill, if that's what it was, felt less like doing something and more like not doing something. A kind of active stillness that extended beyond his body, that made him easy to overlook, simple to dismiss as unimportant. He moved through the empty streets like a ghost given temporary substance. The few people he encountered, beggars huddled in doorways, night workers heading home after long shifts, gang members on patrol, all failed to register his presence. Their gazes slid past him as if he was simply another shadow, another piece of the quarter's broken architecture. It should have been satisfying, this confirmation that his new ability worked as advertised. Instead, it made Zhiro feel more isolated than ever. He had always been avoided, always made people uncomfortable, but at least they'd seen him. Now he was becoming truly invisible, not through any effort of his own, but because something in his manufactured nature made him fundamentally forgettable. Clone 7A. A thing, not a person. Built to be a lock, a key, a seal against forces he couldn't comprehend. The thought threatened to spiral into the kind of paralytic despair that had almost claimed him in the basement. So Zhiro focused instead on the immediate and practical. 1 foot in front of the other. Watch for patrols. Avoid the main thoroughfares where the Bronze Fong maintained permanent presence. Get to Old Mo's stall before the morning crowds arrived. The Rust Quarter transformed in the hours before dawn. The chaotic violence of night gave way to an eerie stillness, as if the district itself was holding its breath between darkness and day. Reality distortions became more pronounced. Zhiro passed a section of street where rain fell upward, the droplets rising from puddles to rejoin clouds that shouldn't have been visible in the pre-dawn gloom. He stepped carefully around a building whose shadow fell in 3 different directions simultaneously, marking it as a place where the 5th Sunder's damage ran particularly deep. His thread sense, or perhaps just the heightened awareness that came from carrying golden sigils under his skin, could perceive the wrongness in these places more clearly now. Not just seeing the distortions, but feeling them, understanding on some intuitive level where reality had been torn and poorly mended. The sensation was simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling, like discovering he could hear colors or taste textures. Old Mo's noodle stall occupied a corner, where 4 alleys met in a configuration that should have been impossible, but somehow worked anyway. The old woman had claimed the spot decades ago, back when she'd been young Ma, and the Rust Quarter had been merely poor rather than reality-warped. She'd survived gang wars, Sunder aftershocks, winter storms that froze 3 competing noodle vendors to death in their stalls, and countless other disasters through a combination of stubbornness, cheap food, and the general understanding that killing Old Ma would mean no one got noodles anymore. The stall was already open. Old Ma rarely seemed to sleep, or perhaps she simply took turns sleeping with her granddaughters in the small apartment above the stall. A single oil lamp illuminated her work area, casting long shadows that danced and flickered as she stirred a large pot of broth that had been simmering since yesterday afternoon. The smell of cheap vegetables and cheaper noodles made Zhiro's stomach clench with painful hunger. Old Ma looked up as he approached, her eyes, roomy with age but still sharp, sliding past him once, twice, before focusing with visible effort. Even his present suppression couldn't entirely overcome decades of familiarity. She knew someone was there, even if every instinct told her to look away. "Ghost boy," she said, her voice carrying the rasp of too many years breathing Rust Quarter air. "Thought you might be dead. There's talk in the streets. Bronze Fong hunting someone hard. Someone who did something terrible to their boys." Zhiro approached the stall slowly, hands visible, making no sudden movements. Old Ma had survived this long by being careful, and careful people in the Rust Quarter often kept weapons close at hand. "Just want to buy some noodles," he said, and was disturbed to hear how rough his own voice sounded. His throat still ached from Kong's grip, and speaking felt like swallowing broken glass. Old Ma studied him for a long moment, and Zhiro wondered what she saw. Could she perceive the golden sigils that marked his skin, visible only when light hit them at certain angles? Could she sense the change in him, the thing that now lived beneath his manufactured humanity? "3 copper crescents," she said finally. "For a bowl, and some discretion about whether I've seen you." It was robbery. Her noodles usually cost 1 crescent, maybe 2 if she was feeling greedy. But Zhiro didn't argue. He fished out 3 coins from his hidden pocket and placed them on the counter, watching as Old Ma's gnarled fingers swept them into an inner pocket of her threadbare robe. She ladled broth into a chipped clay bowl, added a generous portion of noodles, more than she usually served, Zhiro noticed, and topped it with thin slices of something that might have been meat weeks ago, but was now of questionable provenance. She slid the bowl across the counter without meeting his eyes, as she'd always done, and Zhiro accepted it with both hands. The first bite was transcendent. Not because the food was good. It wasn't. Old Ma's noodles had never been good, but because his body desperately needed fuel and didn't care about taste. He ate mechanically, shoveling noodles and broth into his mouth as fast as he could swallow, barely registering the temperature or flavor. Old Ma watched him eat with an expression that might have been concern or might have been calculation. When he'd consumed perhaps half the bowl, she spoke again. "You're leaving?" It wasn't a question. Zhiro paused mid-bite, noodles hanging from his lips in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Yes," he said after swallowing. "Good." Old Ma returned to stirring her pot, her movements steady despite her age. "Whatever you did, whatever you've become, it's too big for the Rust Quarter. You stay here, you die here. Or worse, you do more of whatever you did, and the rest of us die with you." The words should have stung, but Zhiro found he couldn't disagree. He had killed, or permanently crippled, 3 cultivators yesterday. If the Bronze Fong came looking and found him here, they wouldn't be gentle about questioning anyone who might have seen him. Old Ma's stall would become a target, and the old woman who'd fed him terrible noodles for years would pay the price for his presence. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for bringing trouble. Don't be sorry. Be gone." Old Ma's voice was sharp, but not unkind. "You were always marked for something, boy. Had death sitting on your shoulder since you were small. Better you find what it is elsewhere than here." Zhiro finished his noodles in silence, scraping the last bits of broth from the bowl. The food had helped. He could feel strength returning to his limbs, the worst of the hunger pangs subsiding. Not enough to feel truly recovered, but enough to function. He set the bowl down and turned to leave, but old Mo's voice stopped him. "Ghost boy. One more thing." He looked back. The old woman was staring into her pot of simmering broth, not meeting his eyes. "The academy," she said. "You're going to the academy, aren't you?" Heard it in your voice, that desperation. "Looking for answers about what you are." Zhiro said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "They'll take you," old Mo continued. "Not as a student. As a specimen. Something to study, to understand, to use. That's what places like that do. They take things that don't fit, and try to make them fit, one way or another. You go there, you won't come out the same." "I'm already not the same," Zhiro said. "I need answers. Need to understand what I am, what I'm supposed to do. The academy is the only place that might have them. Then go knowing what you're walking into. They'll see what you are. See the marks on you, the wrongness. And they'll want to know how to use it." Old Mo finally looked up, and her eyes were sad. "But maybe that's what you need. Maybe being used is better than being lost." She turned away, dismissing him with the gesture, and Zhiro didn't press for more. He'd gotten more from old Ma than he'd expected. Food, warning, and something that might have been kindness, or might have been simply an old woman's attempt to salve her conscience before sending a boy to his probable doom. He left the stall and moved back into the Rust Quarter's twisted streets, heading northeast toward where the district gradually transitioned into more stable reality. The academy lay perhaps 3 hours' walk beyond the quarter's borders, in a district where wealthy merchants and successful cultivators maintained homes and businesses. A world away from the broken streets and reality-warped alleys that had been his entire existence. Behind him, in the stall he'd just left, old Ma continued stirring her pot and said nothing to the 3 bronze Fong enforcers who arrived minutes later, asking if anyone had seen a thin boy with pale grey eyes and an unsettling stillness about him. She took their copper crescents and served them noodles and told them nothing. Some silences, after all, were worth more than any reward. The journey northeast took Zhiro through parts of the Rust Quarter he'd rarely visited. The borderlands where broken reality gradually gave way to stable space, where buildings stood at proper angles and rain fell in expected directions. These transitional zones were strange in their own way, caught between the impossible and the mundane, never quite committing to either state. He passed through a marketplace that existed in both normal space and a pocket dimension simultaneously. Merchants sold goods from stalls that occupied 2 locations at once, and customers learned to pay attention to which version of reality they were purchasing from, lest they buy vegetables that existed only in one state and vanished when taken beyond the market's bounds. He skirted a plaza where a sunder scar had created a permanent loop in time. The same moment repeating endlessly, the same 5 people eternally walking across the same stones in the same pattern, trapped in a fragment of yesterday that refused to become today. Scholars came sometimes to study them, to try to understand how the loop worked, but no one had found a way to break it. The trapped people didn't seem to know they were trapped, experiencing only that one eternal moment, and Zhiro had heard arguments about whether they were actually suffering or simply existing in a state too alien for normal people to comprehend. He didn't stop to contemplate it. The loop had been there for decades, would probably be there for decades more, and he had more immediate concerns than the metaphysical implications of trapped time. The reality distortions grew less frequent as he progressed, the architecture more stable, until finally he crossed an invisible threshold that marked the true border of the Rust Quarter. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The air felt different, cleaner somehow, as if the fundamental wrongness that permeated his home district simply stopped at this arbitrary line. Guards stood at the checkpoint, official city soldiers in bronze-scaled armor that marked them as servants of the Black Tortoise Confederacy rather than any particular gang. They were there ostensibly to prevent Rust Quarter violence from spilling into respectable neighborhoods, But mostly they just collected bribes from anyone who wanted to pass without extensive questioning. Zhiro approached carefully, his presence suppression active, moving with the small crowd of laborers and merchants who were making the morning crossing. The guard's eyes slid over him once, twice, 3 times, never quite focusing. He was just another thin boy in ragged clothes, beneath notice, easy to forget. He passed through the checkpoint without incident and found himself in a part of Black Tortoise City he'd only seen from a distance. The merchant district, where prosperity was measured in jade and silk rather than copper crescents and survival. The contrast was staggering. Buildings here stood tall and proud, their walls painted in colors that didn't exist in the Rust Quarter. The streets were paved with stones that lay flat and parallel, following geometries that made sense, that didn't twist or bend or lead into spaces that shouldn't exist. People walked without the perpetual wariness that marked Rust Quarter residents, secure in the knowledge that reality would behave predictably from one moment to the next. And the smell, gods, the smell. No sewage in the streets, no rotting garbage piled in corners, no bodies left to decay where they fell. Instead, Zhiro caught whiffs of exotic spices from merchant stalls, fresh bread from bakeries, even flowers from gardens that wealthy families maintained behind their compound walls. It was overwhelming. Beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a reminder of everything the Rust Quarter wasn't, everything Zhiro had never been allowed to have. He moved through the morning crowds, painfully aware of how much he didn't belong. His ragged clothes marked him as Rust Quarter trash, his thin frame and hollow eyes proclaimed his poverty, and despite his present suppression, people unconsciously gave him space, created small bubbles of distance, as if afraid whatever had marked him might be contagious. Which, Zhiro reflected, might not be entirely wrong. He was marked, had been marked since before he understood what marks meant. And now those marks were literal, golden sigils burned into his flesh, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He pulled his threadbare shirt tighter, hoping the gesture might hide the patterns on his skin, and continued northeast. The Azure Dragon Academy lay somewhere ahead, beyond the merchant district, in a section of the city reserved for cultivation schools and scholarly institutions. Oldma had told him once that it was built around a stable Sunder scar, not the chaotic breaks that had created the Rust Quarter, but a controlled tear in reality that the academy used for research and training. Zhiro didn't know if that was true, but he supposed he'd find out soon enough. The morning crowds thickened as he progressed, merchants opening their shops, customers beginning their daily routines, cultivators floating past on flying swords, or simply walking with the casual arrogance of those who knew they stood above normal people in every way that mattered. A group of young cultivators passed close by, laughing about something, their expensive robes marking them as wealthy students from one of the district's schools. One of them, a girl perhaps his age, with elaborate hairpins that probably cost more than Zhiro had seen in his entire life, looked directly at him for a moment. Her eyes widened slightly, and Zhiro tensed, wondering if his present suppression had failed, if she could see through it somehow. But then her gaze shifted away, and she continued walking with her friends as if nothing had happened. Except, had she looked back? Just for a moment, a brief glance over her shoulder before the crowd swallowed her group, and they disappeared around a corner? Zhiro told himself it didn't matter, that he was being paranoid, that even if she'd seen something unusual about him, it was irrelevant to his immediate goal. But unease settled in his stomach nonetheless, a reminder that his awakening had made him visible to forces he didn't understand. Unknown observers are now aware of your existence, the interface had warned. He was beginning to understand what that meant. The sun rose higher as Zhiro walked, transforming the city from pre-dawn grey to morning gold. The light revealed details he'd missed in the dimness, the intricate carvings on building facades, the spirit stone formations that powered street lamps and defensive arrays, the subtle ways that cultivation techniques had been integrated into the city's very architecture. In the Rust Quarter, such things would have been stripped for parts, sold on the black market, used to fuel desperate attempts at survival. Here, they were simply background, so common as to be unremarkable. The wealth on display made Zhiro's stomach turn. Not with envy. He'd never had the mental space for that particular vice, but with a kind of sick understanding. This was what the world looked like for people who mattered. For humans, for cultivators, for anyone who fit properly into the hierarchies that governed existence. No wonder they'd built him in a laboratory. No wonder they'd tried to suppress his consciousness, tried to eliminate his personality, tried to make him a tool rather than a person. Tools didn't ask questions about fairness or justice, or why some people ate terrible noodles in basement hideouts, while others wore jade ornaments worth more than Zhiro's life. Tools just did what they were built to do. The thought carried him through the merchant district and into the scholars' quarter, where the buildings grew more austere, but no less expensive. Here, cultivation academies and research institutions clustered together, their walls high and their gates guarded. Each one proclaimed its specialization through carved symbols and formation arrays. Schools of sword cultivation, pill refinement, beast taming, formation mastery, and a dozen other disciplines Zhiro knew only from rumor and hearsay. And at the end of a long avenue lined with cherry trees that bloomed impossibly despite it being summer, rising above the surrounding buildings like a mountain of jade and gold, stood the Azure Dragon Academy. It was magnificent. Terrifying. Impossible. 7 towers stretched toward the sky, each one carved from a single enormous piece of spirit jade that should not have existed, arranged in a pattern that suggested the constellation of the Azure Dragon. Between the towers, walkways of compressed light connected at impossible angles, defying normal geometry in ways that reminded Zhiro uncomfortably of the Rust Quarter's reality breaks. But these distortions were controlled, intentional, shaped by cultivation techniques and formation arrays, rather than the chaotic aftermath of divine conflict. This was reality bent to serve human will, rather than reality broken beyond repair. The Academy's walls were 40 feet high and inscribed with defensive formations so dense and complex that even Zhiro's untrained eye could recognize them as formidable. The main gate was open, but guarded by cultivators in azure robes, each one radiating the kind of casual power that marked them as at least foundation-building stage. Beyond the gate, Zhiro could see courtyards where students practiced forms and techniques, buildings where lectures must be occurring, and in the distance, at the very center of the academy complex, a 7th structure that wasn't a tower, but rather a sphere of what looked like frozen space. The stable Sunda Skar Oldmar had mentioned, contained and studied rather than feared. This was a place of learning, of power, of answers. This was where Zhiro would find out what it meant to be Clone 7A, 7th seal, manufactured key to a door that must never open. He took a breath, steadied himself, and began walking toward the gate. He'd made it perhaps 20 steps when the interface at the edge of his vision pulsed urgently. Warning. Hostile intent detected. Multiple cultivators approaching. Recommended action. Flee or submit. Zhiro's head snapped around, searching for the threat, but the morning crowd seemed unchanged. Merchants and students and ordinary people going about their ordinary business. Then he saw them. For figures in white robes moving through the crowd with purpose, their paths converging on his location with the precision of predators who'd already selected their prey. And at the center of their formation, guiding them with subtle gestures, a familiar figure whose left eye socket was an empty darkness that seemed to drink the morning light. Headmaster Yao smiled at Zhiro across the distance, showing too many teeth. And the world began to shift and change as the old cultivator's formation activated, trapping Zhiro in place before he could even think to run. With that we come to the end of Chapter 1 of Episode 2. If you liked this, please do give a like to the video. A like and a comment from you is encouraging to the author. If you wish to follow this story for the upcoming chapters, do subscribe to the channel. This story is being written exclusively for our channel. Any comments and appreciation for the story will be passed on to the author.